The fact that there are anti-Semites in Hungary, there's no question about that. Nobody's denying that. But Viktor Orban has been extremely friendly towards Israel, and and that's my measure of all of this.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. According to most of the international media, democracy was defeated in this week's Hungarian election. The victory of incumbent Prime Minister Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party over a multi-party opposition coalition of parties is being depicted as an unfortunate triumph for an authoritarian who has been likened to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Yet some of these assumptions about Hungary, which are widely echoed in much of the Jewish media, in which Orban is frequently assumed to be a right-wing anti-Semite or enabler of anti-Semites, should not be blindly accepted. And that's especially true if we are to come to any rational conclusions, not only about Jewish security, but about how to safeguard democracy in Europe. A lot of the present discussion about Hungary is seen through the lens of the war in Ukraine. Prior to the war, there were a great many loose comparisons between Orban's government and the Putin regime in Russia. This was always misleading, but it is even more so now that most of the world has recoiled in horror from the illegal and brutal invasion of Ukraine and united around the idea that Russian aggression must be halted. Like Israel, Hungary has been criticized for sitting on the fence during the war. But that accusation seems to be as unfair as the ones directed at the Jewish state, since Hungary has condemned Putin's war and taken in as many as 500,000 Ukrainian refugees. But the conclusions that need to be drawn about the war should not be confused with those about how to counter the rising tide of anti-Semitism that has spread across Europe in recent years. In that context, Hungary is something of a conundrum for Jewish observers. Hungary appears to be a relatively safe haven for its Jewish community. A report by the country's Jewish community issued last year pointed out that anti-Jewish violence is rare in Hungary. Though anti-Semitic attitudes were still disturbingly prevalent, Hungarian Jews appear to be free of the fear that characterized Jewish life in most of the continent, especially those nations that are otherwise assumed to be bastions of Western liberalism, like France, Germany, Sweden, and even the United Kingdom. Even though Orban and his government have repeatedly condemned anti-Semitism, some in his party, which is characterized as right-wing populist and nationalist, have been accused of anti-Semitism. It's also true that Orban's government has, like those of other Eastern European countries like Poland, sought to downplay Hungarian anti-Semitism both before and during the Holocaust. That sort of revisionism is deeply troubling, but it should be pointed out that those who are quick to condemn Orban for this have turned a blind eye to the same thing in Ukraine. Although it is currently led by President Volodymyr Zelensky, who is Jewish, the Ukrainian Republic has repeatedly honored Ukrainian nationalists who were guilty of murdering Jews, both in pogroms after World War I and during the Holocaust, while collaborating with the Nazis. Indeed, during the course of his heroic leadership during the current war, which historian Andrew Roberts has characterized as Churchillian, Zelensky has been handing out medals for valor called the Order of Bohdan Khmelnytsky. That name is one that is associated with among the greatest traumas to have befallen the Jewish people. Approximately 100,000 Jews were slaughtered by Khmelnytsky's Cossack forces during their rebellion against Polish overlords in 1648. Arguably, the worst such crime committed against European Jews in the centuries between the Crusades and the horrors of the 20th century. For understandable reasons, that is not held against Zelensky, whose popularity is rightly pointed to as evidence that Ukraine has undergone a change for the better with respect to the Jews. Yet far less egregious associations with Hungary's anti-Semitic past are considered proof of Orban's bad faith by his Jewish critics. Part of this has to do with the widespread belief that Orban's criticisms of Hungarian-born Jewish billionaire George Soros are evidence of anti-Semitism. Fidesz is accused of spreading conspiracy theories about Soros, who is a bitter foe of Orban. But while some anti-Semites say terrible things about Soros, the notion that all criticism of the leftist philanthropist are anti-Semitic is risible. Soros is the leading funder of left-wing causes and candidates in the United States, as well as elsewhere, including groups that are anti-Zionist and dedicating to smearing Israel as an apartheid state. Indeed, unlike Soros, Orban is a friend to Israel. Under his leadership, Hungary has been among the friendliest countries to the Jewish state in Europe. It has voted with Israel in the United States, rather than joining the anti-Semitic majority there, and opposed the world body's efforts to promote Jew hatred via reviving the Durban Conference's anti-racism agenda. Many in the West take Orban at his word when he calls his philosophy illiberal democracy, and assume that any such approach must be bad for the Jews. Certainly, Hungarian democracy is far from perfect, and opposition parties have had trouble making themselves heard in a country where the dominant state-run media is controlled by Orban and other outlets that are largely run by those who are his allies. Still, it's possible to condemn the situation of the press in Hungary while pointing out that America is also not free from faults. In 2020, a powerful combination of mainstream corporate press outlets and big tech companies that control social media and access to the internet helped to largely silence reporting that pointed to corrupt activities by members of President Joe Biden's family by calling it Russian disinformation. Today, those same outlets admitted it was all true. One can also take issue with some of Orban's illiberal ideas without accepting the notion that he is an opponent of democracy. His main fault in the eyes of most of his European critics is his refusal to go along with the same open borders immigration policies that led to a massive influx of largely Muslim migrants from the Middle East and North Africa into Western nations. The direct link between Orban's tough immigration policies that cut off a surge of people who were bringing the Jew hatred that is prevalent in their home countries with them, and the lack of violence against Hungarian Jews is downplayed by the left. But the connection between the two cannot be refuted. Orban's opposition to globalism is assumed by many to be a dog whistle to anti-Semitism. But his defense of sovereign borders and hostility to multilateral institutions is clearly good for the Jews. Orban's belief that governments should uphold traditional values about marriage and the family is derided by those who see them as hostile to the LGBTQ community and truly illiberal. But whether or not you agree with his beliefs, Orban's point about this issue is to some extent illustrated by the largely disingenuous condemnations of legislation recently passed in Florida that merely seeks to ban the sexualization of education for children under 10. Yet so strong is the hostility to Orban that many Jews were willing to back the opposition coalition that sought to defeat him, even though its largest component was the openly anti-Semitic neo-Nazi Jobbik Party. If opposition to illiberal democracy requires acquiescence to a government composed of neo-Nazis, perhaps it's necessary for liberals to rethink their critique of Orban. The same may be true of their knee-jerk assumptions about the nationalist philosophy he espouses, since it seems to rest on ideas that are both good for the Jews of Hungary and cheered when they are espoused by Ukrainian nationalists. In a Europe that has been shaken by the impact of mass immigration and then by Russian aggression, Jews do well to worry about their future as well as that of democracy. But traditional assumptions that the sort of conservative nationalism that Orban espouses is antithetical to Jewish security should not be blindly accepted. Just as the Jews have sometimes found friends in odd places, so too may the future of democracy be more dependent on those who reject liberalism than some liberals are willing to admit. And now to our weekly interview. The world's attention has understandably been riveted on the war in Ukraine. But in the past week, Israel underwent its worst bout of terror attacks in years, with 11 persons slain in 3 separate bloody incidents. The horror coincided with the holding of a summit with 4 Arab nations that was intended to serve as a rallying point to generate opposition to U.S. appeasement of Iran via the impending conclusion of talks to revive an even weaker version of the 2015 nuclear deal. But the event was largely hijacked by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. He sought to pivot away from the lessons of the Abraham Accords, which brought Israelis and Arabs together in spite of the efforts of Palestinians to reject peace, to the failed policies of the past that focused American diplomacy on efforts to pressure Israel into concession to empower Palestinians that have repeatedly demonstrated no interest in this two-state solution that the Biden administration is still trying to sell them. Where then does that leave Israel as it seeks to navigate between the perils of a nuclear Iran and a desire to nip in the bud any thoughts of a third intifada, which the Palestinians will seek to use to get the West to reward them rather than punish them for terrorism? At the same time, Israel is still caught in a difficult position on the Ukraine war, as calls for them to get further involved in the conflict contradict their own security needs. Similarly, European Jews are facing some tough decisions about their future, which the election in Hungary has illustrated. To discuss all of this, we're happy to welcome back to the podcast someone who is one of our favorite columnists, as well as one of our favorite people. Ruthie Blum is a columnist with JNS and the Jerusalem Post. A longtime editor and writer for various publications, she is also a regular commentator on life in Israel and the U.S., and U.S.-Israel relations. She's a winner of the Louis Rappaport Award for Excellence in Commentary and author of the 2012 book, To Hell in a Handbasket, Carter, Obama, and the Arab Spring. Originally from New York City, she moved to Israel in 1977 and currently resides in Tel Aviv. Ruthie Blum, welcome back to Top Story.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, Ruthie, it's great to have you back with us. Let's start by discussing the week of terror that Israel recently underwent. Is it, as some fear, the beginning of a third intifada, or is it merely another illustration of the inevitable result of the encouragement and subsidization of terror by the Palestinian Authority and its Hamas rivals?
Well, I don't think it matters whether you call it officially an intifada or not. There's definitely an uptick in violence. Look, there's always violence, and there's always there are terrorist attacks thwarted all the time. So people don't hear about those. Of course, we hear about the ones that have many casualties, as we saw early or late last month. Whether it's another intifada or not doesn't matter. What matters is that the Palestinians and the Arab Israelis who are sympathetic to them are again putting themselves in the headlines, and the West again is pretending or believing them that this has something to do with a lack of progress on the peace front and a lack of a two-state solution. This is a total lie. They don't want a two-state solution. Has nothing to do with that. It has only to do with their desire to kill Jews, basically.
Well, that segues right to where I was going next. It's not just a matter of whether you call it an intifada, and it's the prospect of it involving Israeli Arabs, as some of the terrorists involved in the recent attacks were Israeli citizens, rather than residents of the territory ruled by the Palestinian Authority. What happened last May with Arab riots in Israeli cities certainly bolstered a narrative about the increasing radicalization of the Arab population, despite the fact that one of the victims was a heroic Israeli Arab policeman, and the fact that an Arab party is still sitting in the government. Are those fears about Israeli Arab radicalization reasonable, or are they exaggerated? Where do you see that?
Well, it's hard to know the numbers, but one thing I can say, and I don't know whether it's as widespread as some people make it or not as others. What I can say is that the as is the case with the Palestinians' the false narrative among Arab Israelis, or the apologists for them, I think is more accurate to say, is that they're doing this in response to Israeli policies, in response to poverty, or to the fact that they don't have proper garbage collection or employment, or things like that. That's total nonsense. It is true that there are radicalized Arab Israeli citizens, and there always have been, as far back as 20 years ago, when in the suicide bombing intifada, 22 years ago actually, there also were riots among Arab citizens of Israel. The Palestinians were the ones committing the suicide bombings, in which Arabs got killed as well, by the way. But
Sure.
the main issue here is that the story that the West, and particularly people like U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, is telling itself is false about the reason behind all this stuff. And that's really more important than whether this is a new or old intifada. That I think is crucial to stress.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. I think it's a separate question about the future of Israeli Arabs and whether they are going through a shift from an Israeli to a Palestinian identity. And as some of them, certainly some of their political representatives seem to articulate that.
Oh,
But
definitely.
what about Israel's response to terrorism? Does the Israeli public have complete confidence in the ability of the security forces to deal with these revived threats of terror? Or are there some systemic problems or perhaps political problems related to the current government that need to be addressed first before we can say that this issue is being dealt with?
Yes, well, first of all, apropos the political situation, Israel has a public security minister who's in charge of the police, for example, that's in his purview, who is a known leftist with very bad politics. And it shows in statements he's made in the past and in his behavior throughout this last series of murderous attacks. For example, it's not only is he incompetent. I mean, he didn't even know he was at the funeral of a victim, and didn't even know that the terrorist had already been killed. And then he tweeted other ridiculous things. So a lot of people, he has very low public support, this public security minister. His name is Omer Bar-Lev.
Right.
But the Israeli public generally tends to have faith in the army, not so much in the police, I have to say, in the army for sure, and in the internal security services generally. But the fact that nobody knew that these attacks were imminent or didn't catch on to them, didn't know that the perpetrators were posting threats on social media, that was worrisome. And worse than that, the one of the perpetrators, all of them actually had sat in Israeli jails, and they were given light sentences, and judges deemed them fit for release. And that is a systemic problem, not related to an uptick in terrorism.
Yeah, part of this, and certainly you reference this in your most recent column, is that this is coinciding with the beginning of Ramadan. And, these kinds of things, incitement always seems to revolve at times around holidays, both Jewish and Muslim. How much of an impact is that having? And this is sort of out of the old playbook of Palestinian extremism that dates back to the early 20th century, doesn't it?
Definitely. But I'll tell you, they're given real encouragement by the White House and the State Department, because in the lead up to Ramadan, all you had were speeches about how, from Blinken in particular, how we have to be very careful for there not to be any violence during Ramadan. And then he gave a list of possible perpetrators of, or let's say causes for such violence, listing mainly Israeli things, Israeli policies in that. He said, for example, settlement expansion. I mean, he bought into the entire lie of the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah and Hamas in Gaza. That's one thing. Second, he then met with King Abdullah in Jordan and said the same thing. We have to make sure that there's quiet during Ramadan. These are signals. Terrorists are evil, but they're not all stupid.
Right, as if the lack of quiet is blamed on the victims of terrorism rather than the perpetrators of terrorism. They always it flips the narrative. Ruthie, last week's summit with Arab nations, which was historic because it was held inside Israel, was supposed to be about a common anti-Iran agenda. But that's not exactly how it played out, was it? How did Secretary of State Blinken shift the narrative there? And more importantly, why did Israel's government let him get out of it?
Okay, so first of all, you have to remember that both Blinken and Foreign Minister Yair Lapid are two leaders from governments that were not a party to the Abraham Accords. They are both in governments that came after serious rivals. In Blinken's case, he came after the Trump administration. In Lapid's case, he came after the Netanyahu administration. So we'll start with that. These were the new players on the block in this constellation. And Blinken did a terrible thing, but just by being there, it was a terrible thing. Because while the United States is begging Iran to return to a worse version of the JCPOA, he is attending a summit based on, or a key factor of that summit and of the Abraham Accords altogether, is a common desire to counter the Iranian nuclear threat. So Blinken's presence put a damper on the occasion and made it very difficult for the Arab leaders to say what they meant outright. And worse than that is that Blinken inserted the Palestinians into this issue where it absolutely didn't belong. Because let's face it, all along, the Palestinians could have joined the Abraham Accords if they had wanted to. They have been able to make peace with Israel over and over again for years and years. It's their intransigence that is preventing it. So the reason that they're not a part of it is because all those other countries, the statement was that they have come to terms and made their peace with the existence of the state of Israel as a Jewish state and as an ally. And that's one thing that the Palestinians can't accept. And so Blinken introducing them into that process was a terrible thing. It was terrible for the Accords. It was a terrible message to the Palestinians. And it's no accident that there's an uptick in terrorism during this whole period. Oh,
Yeah.
and as for Israel,
You wrote
you
this.
asked about
Okay,
Israel. Well,
go ahead.
that's right. Lapid was not in the Netanyahu government. Lapid is somebody who opposed the Netanyahu government. He's also slated to become Israel's prime minister in a year and a half. And though he supports the Abraham Accords, he's also a two-state solution person. So that's what I wanted to say about that, why he allowed
Yeah.
it.
Sure. You wrote this week in JNS about how some of the commentary about the summit wound up illustrating the fallacy at the heart of advocacy for the two-state solution that you just referenced. Can you tell us more about this and why it matters?
Okay, well, the two-state solution has become this sort of catchphrase, and the whole world uses it, and it sounds really good, a Jewish state alongside a Palestinian state. What could be bad about that? Well, the Palestinians don't see it that way. Let's start with that. The Palestinians don't want a state alongside of Israel. And Palestinian Authority leader Mahmoud Abbas doesn't want a state at all and never has, by the way, and because the minute he were to achieve statehood, he would go into the dustbin of history or be assassinated by his people or something like that. Striving for statehood is what kept him on the world stage at the UN and everywhere else. He's only relevant because he's supposedly seeking statehood. So that's one thing. The other thing is that there have been peace processes in Israel that saw Israel relinquishing land, territory, all kinds of things. There was the Oslo Accords, there were the Y agreements. It goes on and on and on. And the only thing Israel ever got in return from the Palestinians was more terrorism. Also, the fallacy that the 1967 war is what started this whole issue, which is to say Israel supposedly occupied Palestinian territory, which wasn't Palestinian, by the way, occupied Palestinian territory, and there's the root of the whole problem. But the Palestinians themselves say that they want Israel out of here. They want the entire state of Israel to be Palestine. And therefore, there can be no two-state solution. And many Israelis who really believed in that and believed that that was the reason for the conflict in 67 became disillusioned with the Palestinians, and not only with Arafat, also with his successor, Abbas. And rightly so, they became disillusioned because there's no hope for it with this kind of regime. And the younger generation is even more radical than its parents.
Yeah, it all goes back to this Nakba narrative, though, that the Palestinians continue and their enablers continue to put forth, which is, rooted in the delegitimization of Israel's existence. So, I mean, it's a contradiction to the two-state solution talk that seems to go on alongside it.
Exactly, because what they're really disturbed by is the establishment of Israel in 1948. So there's no way to counter that. It's like saying, listen, it's the same fallacy that is causing America and Europe to beg Iran to go back to a deal that Iran never honored, and that in any case is a terrible deal, and that all it does is give Iran billions of dollars with which to step up its nuclear program and bombs.
Yeah, well, it's certainly one of the discouraging aspects of this discussion is the way that ideas that were clearly debunked by what happened after Oslo and repeated Palestinian rejections of peace, in which the Abraham Accords seem to recognize, are being revived as if nothing has happened in the last 20 years to discredit them. Is this ideology? Is this just sort of a policy position that became a religion, both in Israel among some sectors, and certainly in the American foreign policy establishment?
Oh, well, definitely, it is. It's a mixture. It's a mixture of mantras that have no meaning, and the lucrative business for Palestinian terrorists. Let's not forget that. Palestinian terrorists and their families receive monthly stipends that are way above any salary that they can earn in the PA, or even in Israel for that matter, where they come in droves to work in Israel. And then, may I say, they come in right now. As a matter of fact, the Israeli government was giving Hamas 20,000 permits for Palestinians in Gaza to come in and work in Israel. So, if I would call that insane, again, because it's this attempt to imagine. It's the constant imagining that you have to give them something, give them work, give them money, give them something that will prevent them from wanting to kill Jews. But it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, and speaking of magical thinking, let's turn to the impending adoption of the new and much weaker Iran nuclear deal that you already referenced. Why do you think the Biden administration is so dedicated to this effort and even prioritizing it over its anti-Russian policy over Ukraine, as well as refusing to face up to the fact that the deal guarantees that Iran will get a nuclear weapon rather than prevent it. I mean, you wrote about U.S. Iran relations in your book, really is now 10 years ago. Where do you see this coming from?
Well, it's definitely coming from the Obama administration. Let's not forget that Biden was not only Obama's vice president, but many of the same players are in this administration. And Obama was determined to push that deal through. And he did it. He succeeded at doing that. And then when Trump came along and in 2018 withdrew from the deal, and by the way, one key impetus for his having done so was Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu having shown him the huge trove that the Mossad snuck out of Tehran and brought back to Israel. And in those documents, the documents proved that they had no intention of stopping anything. They hadn't stopped anything. The JCPOA did not prevent them from doing anything, and that they never would stop building their bombs, and for military purposes. I mean, we knew that they were lying when they said that their nukes are for civilian purposes. We knew they were lying, but here there was actual proof, documentation of it. So that actually spurred Trump to do what he had promised to do in his election campaign, which was rip up the deal. And he did it. So part of this is Biden's and his team, the desire and intent on undoing anything that President Trump did.
Yeah. Well, once this new deal is put into place, and there's very little doubt that it will be, and Iran is once again enriched and empowered both by the terms of the accord and the cash it will receive, what are Israel's options? The Bennett-Lapid government is seemingly united in opposition and in thinking it a terrible thing, but do you think they will have any recourse against it, let alone any freedom of action given by the Biden administration to strike Iran if that is the only way to stop it from getting a nuclear weapon?
Yes, well, it doesn't look good for Israel on this score. And to be honest, I'm not sure that if Netanyahu were prime minister right now, he would have much greater recourse. Going up for Israel to go up against the United States is very problematic. But what makes the current situation worse is the fact that Israel has a government that is completely heterogeneous and has elements in it that are far left. It has elements that support Iran. It has elements that believe in the two-state solution. It's got all kinds of elements there, and they're not in agreement in the first place. So now, though there is agreement that Iran has to be stopped, the question is, will Iran be stopped by Israel's continuing to do these targeted strikes on facilities, on these strikes, for example, on convoys in Syria from Iran, and even Iranian targets. That's the question. Is it going to continue in this kind of dribble of attacks, or will Israel be able to launch a serious attack on the facilities? It's really hard to know. First of all, it's hard to know if Israel has the actual capability to do so. But it certainly will be hindered in doing so if America goes up against it. And speaking of this is why it was so important for Israel to maintain some kind of relations with Russia, even in spite of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, because the relations with Russia enabled Israel to have some kind of freedom of movement in the skies over Syria. And endangering that could imperil Israel.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Well, we'll get to Russia in a couple of minutes, but let's go a little further into the Iran issue. If Israel does acquiesce to Iran being a threshold nuclear state, and that seems to be part of what it might have to do if it doesn't have an option after the New Deal is put in place, what will that mean in practical terms for it as well as its Arab neighbors?
Oh, I think that Israel will be, for the first time, maybe for the first time in its history, um, other than maybe the Yom Kippur War, you could say the Six-Day War, but those were short and decisive victories. I think Israel will be in a genuine existential crisis. And the reason is that Iran already seems to possess long-range ballistic missiles with a range that could reach Israel. And Iran continues to threaten the Zionist entity with annihilation. And I think Iran means business. I mean, certainly that regime, and not that there are any moderates in that regime, but now President Raisi is particularly hardline. So there's no even pretending the way we did with his predecessor, that there's some kind of moderation in there. So he's aligned completely with the supreme leader and all the ayatollahs, and I suppose we can only pray that that before any of this happens, the administration in Washington will shift, or Congress in the midterm elections, and that the same thing will happen in Israel. That maybe this government will fall. I mean, this is the only thing I can see as a possibility to overcome the problem that seems to be imminent.
Yeah, that's actually my next question to you to conclude this part of the discussion. Will any of this, certainly, sort of a defeat on Iran, have an impact on the future of the current coalition? Is it? I mean, yes, they always hang by a thread, but it's 61 votes, or the votes of 61 people that don't want to face new elections and have jobs that they don't want to lose. So, is it impervious to world events, or is there actually room for it to be toppled? With the caveat being that if it is toppled, then the alternative is a government led by Netanyahu, which a majority of the Knesset does thinks is a worse problem than Iran, perhaps.
That's right. Well, Israel and America are in a similar situation in the sense that even disgruntled Republicans in the United States, there are a whole slew of them who would never support Trump, no matter what. The same thing in Israel. There are many right-wingers, including in the Likud party, who have an aversion to Netanyahu. So it's not definite that Netanyahu would lead the next government. The question is, are there going to be leaders in America and Israel who are on the same page about the dangers of Iran and meaning it? That's the question. And as I said, Naftali Bennett, the current prime minister of Israel, he means that Iran can't go nuclear. He means it, but what can he do about it? It's not clear. And you're right to say that though this coalition is hanging by a thread, it's a very strong coalition because it's based on the fact that no single party dares topple it for fear and justified fear, that each of these parties knows that if it topples the government, it's also going to disappear. It'll be punished by its voters, each party. So I don't see the government toppling anytime soon. So then the question is, what happens in Iran? Maybe Iran won't sign the deal. Maybe Iran, it's really hard to know what's going to happen. And I'm praying that there is actually more time than we've been warned, because for the last few years we keep hearing that in 6 months or in 2 years they're going to be a nuclear threshold state. We keep hearing that, and time keeps passing. So I'm hoping that we can buy time.
Well, I think I think we all share that prayer. I'm not sure that Iran can, anytime Iran says no, Biden, like Obama before him, will just bow to their demands and give up whatever it is that they want. That's clearly the dynamic. Let's turn now to what's still the top story around the world: the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Despite all the aid it sent and the refugees it absorbed, Israel is still being criticized, including by the Ukrainians, for being insufficiently hostile to Russia, as well as not getting involved militarily. Let's explain a little bit why this is unfair. And do you think most Israelis agree that their government should do more to intervene in the conflict, or do they want to stay out of it? Where do you see that breaking down?
I think most Israelis think that it's a moral duty to take in as many refugees as possible and to help in any way possible. But having said that, most Israelis think that Israel is doing a ton to help Ukraine. Israel set up a field hospital there. Israel is taking in refugees. Israel by the way, the Israeli prime minister was negotiating with Zelensky, between Zelensky and Putin. I mean, considering the fact that Israel isn't even in Europe and doesn't share a border with Russia other than the Syrian border, Israel has done more than any individual state as far as I can tell, and I think Israelis know that. Um, it's not just unfair to be attacking Israel for this. I mean, actually, why would Israel, such a tiny country, why would Israel have to be responsible for this? Um, More than it's already taking responsibility. It makes no sense. And Zelensky, excuse me, I mean, I feel terrible for the Ukrainian people or what they're going through. But Zelensky had a terrible chutzpah to go before the Knesset and attack the Israeli government. That is not exactly the way to make friends and influence people, I would say. Furthermore, Ukraine just abstained in a disgusting anti-Semitic vote at the UN Human Rights Council. So, excuse me, I mean, maybe we should ask Zelensky to help us combat Palestinian terrorism and send over some people to help us.
Oh, that's an excellent point about what Ukraine did in the UN. But of course, at a time when Zelensky is sort of the world's hero, he can get away. You referenced his speech to the Knesset, in which you speak of chutzpah. He basically did some Holocaust revisionism, basically spread Soviet disinformation about who was helping whom during the Holocaust.
Exactly.
I'm curious, how do you think that played in Israel? Do you think that has any lasting effect? Or is just everybody so mad at Putin, so horrified by the videos of what's going on in Ukraine, the possibility there have been some terrible war crimes? That's sort of one of the latest stories in the last few days. Does all of that does all of that matter? I mean, I know it in a piece that I wrote this week, and earlier in this podcast, I noted that he's giving out medals for Zelensky is giving out medals for heroism to Ukrainian soldiers that are named after Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who massacred 100,000 Jews in 1648. Does anybody care about any of this stuff, or are we just we're so rooted in the moment, of the horror of this war that we just say that it doesn't matter?
Well, in Israel, many people do care about it. So it really, again, as is everything in Israel, this particular question is divided along political lines, for the most part, anyway. Because you have many on the right wing and many on the right openly oppose Zelensky right now, and some quietly oppose him and won't say so because it's not good timing. There are Holocaust survivors who say, the Ukrainians were more vicious than the Nazis, and we have no sympathy for Ukraine. And even if you say to them, okay, but those World War II was a while ago, okay, these are the younger people.
Yeah, right. That was 80 years ago, right? Ruthie, what are Holocaust survivors saying about this? And that's always a big issue in Israel.
Many were furious. First of all, they were saying that the Ukrainians during World War II not only participated in the massacre of Jews, but did so gleefully, even more than the Nazis. I mean, and then there are and people on the right in Israel tend to be far more critical of Zelensky. It's not that they're supporters of Putin. It's that they're more critical of Zelensky in the sense that they question, for example, the veracity of some of the reports that came out of Ukraine. And I think they're right to do so because we discovered, for example, when there was a whole report that the Holocaust Memorial at Babi Yar had been hit by a Russian missile. It turns out that was totally fake news. It had not been hit or even damaged in the slightest. So it makes you question, is it true? Are the horror stories coming out of there all true? We don't know. And one of the reasons we don't know is that the Russian propaganda machine, Ukrainians are used to, that's their culture too, all right?
Yeah.
They have that Soviet mindset ingrained in them. So we won't know until after this is all over what the real facts are. But most Israelis are sympathetic to the horrors
Sure.
of, to the women and children who are running and leaving their homes, and they are sympathetic and do support aid to Ukraine in any way we can give it.
Yeah, I guess the question is there any real support within Israel for taking a more aggressive stand towards Russia because of the points you referenced earlier about the relations in Syria, because Russia is basically a neighbor in with its armed forces in Syria, and whether they will acquiesce to Israeli actions against Iran there.
Right, but there's not much. What can Israel really do against Russia? What kind of sanctions, for example? Okay, so we have Russian-born billionaires. Okay, so they've been humiliated or something by Israel, and they've forced to resign from the board of this, the board of that. Abramovich had to sell his sports team, and there's that kind of thing going on. And again, though, Israel is not a major, let's say, major funder of Russia in the first place. So Victoria Nuland's, saying to Israel, "What do you want to be? Do you want to be on the wrong side of history?" I'm paraphrasing, not
Yeah,
quoting.
let's clarify who you're talking about.
Well, excuse me, yes. The Undersecretary for, what is her official title? Undersecretary of State uh, for, so, there I
Well,
have
whatever it is, yeah.
lost her title, right?
She's a veteran State Department official through the last few administrations,
Right,
except
veteran
for
State
Trump.
Department
Yeah.
official, and she is and she recently was extremely critical of Israel for not sanctioning Russia enough, and saying, "Really, you want to be part of that dirty money machine?" Again, I'm paraphrasing. So it is unfair to Israel again. By the way, there are stories emerging from the field hospital in Ukraine that Israel set up and sent tons of doctors and supplies, and have been really working hard round the clock to help Ukrainians in distress. Turns out that there are Ukrainians traveling many, many miles, braving the Russian onslaught, to go get medical treatment, elective medical treatment in that field hospital. So, uh, I think Israel really does not deserve the slightest bit of criticism in this whole mixture.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. Lastly, in the time we have remaining, let's talk a bit about the reaction to the election in Hungary and the interesting double standards that some Jews have about Holocaust denial or the honoring of anti Semites when it's done by Viktor Orban's government, as opposed to when it happens, as we previously referenced, under Zelensky, who, as I said, is giving out medals for bravery named after a person who
Right.
slaughtered 100,000 Jews. What's behind, do you think, the assumption that Orban is an anti Semite when Hungary is actually friendly to Israel, votes with Israel in the United Nations, which Ukraine does not? And by all accounts, and the numbers put forward even by the Hungarian Jewish community, its Jews are safer than those in Western Europe.
Oh, no question about it. I'll tell you something. Viktor Orban has gotten a bad rap all along. And if you notice, the people giving him a bad rap are always on the left. Let's start. I mean, sometimes if you don't know enough about a situation, just look to see who the critics are. Okay? The left attacks Viktor Orban all the time and attacked Netanyahu for being friendly to Orban. Orban is pro America and pro Israel, and that was extremely important because Eastern Europe, sadly, became more of an ally than Western Europe. And, there's the fact that there are anti Semites in Hungary, there's no question about that. Nobody's denying that. But Viktor Orban has been extremely friendly towards Israel, and and that's my measure of all of this. And had Zelensky exhibited genuine gratitude or friendliness towards Israel, I wouldn't be criticizing him either right now.
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of interesting issues there. One, it seems to me inarguable that the lack of violence against Jews in Hungary is linked to one of the policies that Orban is most criticized for, which is basically he closed his borders to
That's right.
immigrate, unlike most of the rest of Europe, to immigration from the Middle East and North Africa, and from people bringing the anti-Semitism that they had at home, in the Islamic world with them to Europe. They didn't get to do that in Hungary, so that's one factor. So that's kind of an ironic thing, and yet that is something for which Jews continue to bash him. And I think it's also fascinating to me that many Jews, including Jews in Hungary, were willing to support the coalition against Orban, which, frankly, Michelle Goldberg, a New York Times leftist anti-Zionist columnist, actually likened to the coalition against Netanyahu. Even though that coalition actually included with its major element was the Jobbik Party, which is neo-Nazi and openly anti-Semitic. But yet that was better than this guy who was supposedly the worst thing ever.
That's right. Well, as I said, look to the enemies and you'll understand it. First of all, his closed border policy. The left doesn't like that, okay? And Jews on the left don't like it. Whether or not it ushers in Jew killers. The fact is, though, that the other side of this coin is not only that he closed the borders to the elements from outside that might be anti-Semitic, but internally, there is less tolerance for the kind of political correctness that also breeds anti-Semitism on the left. So it's not just, in left among the elites. I don't mean, the anti-Semitism. There's Islamist anti-Semitism. But then there's the other kind. And that's what Orban, that combination of forbidding Islamism and also not buying into every radical Western politically correct belief, and that
Yeah,
goes for gender and everything else. He does not
yeah.
buy that culturally.
Well, there are two elements here. One is, I like to continue to point out, it's ironic to me that people who bash nationalism everywhere else and bash Jewish nationalism, which is to say Zionism, as somehow racism, yet they're right now cheering for nationalism in Ukraine, because everybody understands that in order for the Ukrainian people to defend their sovereignty and their culture and their right to self-determination, they need a sovereign state. Yet that something seems to be denied to Israel. Now, the link that makes Hungary, which is a small Eastern European country, relatively small, relevant to this is that the person that is sort of at the crux of the debate in Hungary is George Soros, a Hungarian-born Hungarian Jew who became a billionaire leftist philanthropist, who is despised by Orban, who despises Orban in turn. And yet, the whole focus of his Open Society Foundation, which is the largest funder of sort of leftist causes and liberal candidates in the United States, I might add, as well as sort of anti-Zionist groups operating in Israel, is that he's opposed to, he's for open borders, and yet the antagonism towards Soros is considered proof that Orban is an anti-Semite somehow. Explain that.
Oh, that little trick of accusing people who attack Soros of anti-Semitism is getting a little stale, okay? Because it doesn't matter whether George Soros is a Jew. What matters is his ideology and what he funds. And therefore, to attack him is perfectly legitimate. It has nothing to do with his being a Jew. That's all there is to it. And of all the accusations, that one is the most disingenuous.
No, I think that's very true. Ruthie, thank you so much for coming on and giving the benefit of your insights, as you do every week in your columns for JNS. We also want to thank our audience. Whether you're listening to us on Spotify or on any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us on Facebook, the JNS YouTube channel, or on JBS TV, please like and or subscribe to Top Story and give us good reviews. Please let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.